So the first example is the one I've just described, and if you go to the blank worksheets ebook and print out a lot of these pages, then you can create your own experiments. So situation, body shaking during a panic attack, either outside or at home. Target thought, I'm going to go crazy if I don't control this shaking in my body, I have to control it. Safety behavior, tensing up to try and stop the shaking. You try desperately not to shake, I have to stop this, okay? The experiment, the behavioural experiment, is let the shaking be as it is, or even allow it to increase without trying to stop it. And then you write down the outcome and conclusion, which may be shaking actually lessened a bit. I felt less fearful because I felt that I was in charge of it. Ideas for further practice. Deliberately practice shaking every day to get used to the sensation. Alright, interoceptive exposure, that's another exposure practice you can do. If shaking is something you fear a lot, then you can deliberately practice that feeling of shaking every day to get used to the sensation. The second experiment is reproducing a feared stimulus in a controlled environment. So, situation supermarket, and your target thought is, if the supermarket is too hot, I will pass out. So obviously you have a fear about very hot rooms and that you're going to get so warm that you'll pass out. And that's probably when you avoid. When you get too hot, you leave and you're left with your anxiety at a catastrophic level, wondering what might have happened. Your safety behavior probably is that you always wear light clothes, you carry a bottle of water in case you overheat, you stay near the exit so that you can get away. So the behavioural experiment, it might be something like this. At home, alright, in a controlled environment, turn the heat up full and wear lots of warm clothes. Can you see how interesting an experiment that is? You're going to see what happens if when you do get too hot and you have lots of clothes on and it's too warm. Do you pass out? That's what you're going to test. The outcome and conclusion, I got very hot but I didn't pass out. You know, people just don't pass out when they're just too hot in a room with normal style heating. I proved that I can tolerate a lot of heat without any problem. So when you actually do it and you exaggerate it to an extreme level and you're still okay, that's real evidence, real proof about what actually happens. So rather than you having this catastrophic, imaginary idea of what might happen, you'll know what happens. Ideas for further practice may be wear warm clothes in the supermarket. So actually do an exposure practice, going into the supermarket, knowing it might be hot, and wear warm clothes. Can you see how that takes you further and further towards your fears so that you can get used to it, so you can see that your catastrophic predictions don't actually happen? Third example, experiment with dropping a safety behavior. So the situation is driving. Target thought, I will panic or pass out if I don't keep the car window down when I'm driving. A lot of people have this. They feel stuffy in a car, it's too hot, it's confined, they don't feel there's enough air, and they feel if they don't keep the window down, they'll pass out. It's a catastrophic thought. Safety behavior obviously is they always drive with the car window down, even when it's freezing cold outside. So, interesting behavioural experiment. Ask a friend to take me for a long drive and keep the windows closed. Alright, you see the way that's a smaller step towards your goal. It would be too much to do that on your own because you might fear if I pass out, I'll crash the car or whatever, and that's too big a thing to take on too soon. So you test it first, how you can sit in a car on a drive with the windows down and see what happens. Alright, it's an easier way to approach it. Outcome and conclusion, I didn't pass out, I felt some panic, because you're anticipating that something's going to happen, but it passed. And also observe that your friend did not feel the need for more air. So there's always enough air, even if the windows are closed. Ideas for further practice. Practice when I am driving, but bring a friend on the first journey. So you might feel that it's helpful to have somebody with you while you practice first of all. And when you get used to that, then you can try it yourself. Next example, experiment with dropping safety behavior and allowing the anxiety to increase. So situation, late at night in bed. Target thought, I will go crazy if I don't control my racing thoughts. So you're lying in bed and your thoughts are going round and round and you're worrying about everything and catastrophizing and just very anxious, and you can't stop the thoughts, and you're thinking, I'm going to go mad if I can't stop this, I'm not going to get any sleep, and so on. Safety behavior, you use distraction to try and control the thoughts. Right? You try and think of something else. You count sheep. You sit up. You watch TV. You listen to the radio. You do anything but you try to stop the thoughts. So, let's try an interesting behavioural experiment. Let the thoughts race without trying to stop them at all, or without using any distraction. Just actually let them be as they are. You can be mindful of them. You can observe them without judging them as good or bad. Remember the mindfulness exercise, just observe the thought arising and going, and another one coming and going, like clouds passing by. And don't try to change them. Don't try to get rid of them. And find out what happens. See if it's your safety behavior of resisting and avoiding that's perhaps keeping the thoughts going around your head. It's the only way you're going to find out is to experiment with it. The outcome and the conclusion, I didn't go crazy, I actually felt more relaxed, strangely. So ideas for further practice. Say the thoughts out loud, repeat them many times. So you're going as far as the thoughts that you hate, that you want rid of so badly, say them out loud, repeat them. Like a mantra. See if they still bother you so much after that. It's a very interesting experiment. So the next experiment is the one that we described earlier, where you role play a feared situation to observe the outcome. So situation, supermarket checkout, target thought, I'll be completely embarrassed and humiliated if my hand shakes while paying at the supermarket. And you might add in there that everyone else will see how anxious I am, they'll all look at me, they'll stare at me, they'll laugh at me. So catastrophic thinking. Safety behavior, usually avoidance, or you attempt to control the shaking. You either tense up your hand, your body, you hold your hand with your other hand, whatever. So interesting behavioural experiment may be deliberately shake your hand to observe people's reactions. So you actually go into the supermarket, go to the counter knowing that you're going to slightly shake your hand and you're going to see what actually happens. Or if you feel you can't do that, ask a friend, or if you're going to see a therapist, get them to do it for you, and while you observe what actually happens. So a possible outcome and conclusion may be you realise I couldn't be sure that anyone really noticed. The cashier just got on with her job and didn't seem any different. She was actually quite pleasant. This can happen with these experiments. Ideas for further practice. Maybe I could knock something over to see people's reactions. So can you see that when you take it to this extreme where you're going towards your feared consequences so much, it actually cuts back on the amount of fear you feel, because you're taking control, you're taking charge, you're experimenting with it. Okay, it's not all guesswork and fear that's in the back of your mind, anticipatory anxiety. You actually get to know what actually happens. Next experiment with deliberately repeating a feared stimulus. So this example is the situation, words that trigger anxiety. A lot of people with panic disorder are afraid of certain words that trigger anxiety. And your target thought is, I can't cope with those words. I don't want to hear them. I don't want to know. Don't tell me. Don't say that again. If you hear the word, you avoid. You avoid reading, saying, or hearing the words. Your behavioural experiment may be repeat the words a certain number of times every day. And then increase the frequency every day until you get used to them. So what happens is you have a certain word or phrase and it triggers anxiety, so you avoid it. And your mind is left with, connecting that thought to anxiety, to fear, and so on. And by avoiding it, your anticipatory anxiety is high. Your imagination is left at a catastrophic level. But if you repeat the word every day, first of all, obviously it's going to cause you a bit of anxiety. And the second time, and the third time, or the second day or the third day, you will get more used to it. That's what happens when you repeatedly face something very gradually. You get more and more used to it. So, outcome and conclusion. Initially I felt quite anxious, so you will expect that. But after repeating the words many times, they became just words in my head. And they stopped triggering more anxiety. Possible ideas for further practice might be write the words down and keep them visible in front of me. You just get used to things the more you look at them, the more you listen to them. If you're doing it in a controlled way. Like watching a scary movie 100 times, you know the 100th time that movie it'll be difficult for it to scare you as much as it did the first time, that's for sure. So, summary of workbook 3, practicing recovery. Graduated exposure is quickest and most effective way to be free of panic for good. That is the absolute truth. Workbooks 1 and 2 are extremely helpful, but putting it into practice is vital. Practice interceptive exposure to lose your fear of the bodily symptoms of panic. So if you haven't got agoraphobia and you're not afraid of particular situations and you're very afraid of certain symptoms and sensations, then it's important that you face those symptoms and sensations very gradually so that you get used to them, so that you can test your new information, and your new skills. If you have agoraphobia and you've got a fear of external situations, you practice real life in vivo exposure. You can also drop your safety behaviors one by one as you do any exposure practice. Bodily symptoms or external situations. You're going to have safety behaviors in both areas and you can drop those. If all else fails, if you really don't want to face anything in real life, you can start with imaginal exposure. It doesn't matter how gradually you start the exposure practice as long as you start. You create fear hierarchies and begin exposure practice on the least feared situation. And you repeat until your fear of the situation is minimal. And if you practice exposure every day, so it's very important to repeat it, you will lose your fear in the same way as if you watch the scary movie 100 times. You get so used to it, it becomes boring, not frightening, and wouldn't that be great? So when you lose your fear of panic, it will stop happening.